Hello, good evening. My name is Simon Godwin, and I am the Artistic Director of the Shakespeare Theatre Company in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be back joining you this evening for Shakespeare Hour Live. Well, I've been away from the show for some weeks and 8 months. I've been in London directing Romeo and Juliet, so away doing Shakespeare matters for the National Theatre. I'm delighted to say that PBS were one of the core funders of the project, which means that Romeo and Juliet, the movie, shot entirely on the stage of the National Theatre in London, is going to be shown appropriately on Shakespeare's birthday. That is, of course, April the 23rd. So I'll be talking more about that experience of creating Shakespeare in a pandemic, perhaps as part of this evening, and certainly as part of the weeks to come. But mainly, I'm just delighted to be given, as I was, permission from your government to be allowed to return from England back to America to host this show amongst my many other duties as artistic director. Well, before we get started, a few words of thanks. Shakespeare Hour Live is a component of Shakespeare Everywhere, which is, of course, made possible by the visionary Beach Street Foundation. Additional support for Shakespeare Hour Live is generously provided by Nan Beckley, and tonight's episode is sponsored by Freddie Lipsjane and Scott Richard Berg. So enormous thanks to all of you for making tonight possible. Well, this evening is the final episode in our Shakespeare Icons series, and I can't think of a better person to be joining us tonight to talk about Shakespeare from an iconic point of view. That is the founding director of Shakespeare Theatre Company, the man who I had the great privilege to take over from, and that is none other than the wonderful, extraordinary Michael Kahn. Michael, hello, good evening.
Hi, hello. I'm very pleased to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show, Michael. I'm guessing you're with us from New York, is that right?
I'm in New York. We've been sort of locked down for the snow, which is a little different, but we're walking around now. And it's been a complicated time, but you learn an awful lot during a pandemic. Well, I've never been in one before, but you learn a lot about what you think, what you believe in, how you handle yourself. And it's been a learning experience, and therefore it's been very valuable.
Wow,
that's terrible for everybody who's involved in the theater, and especially, of course, the Shakespeare Theatre.
Oh, well, thank you, Michael. It's so exciting to have you with us, and I'm so looking forward to hearing about your discoveries during this turbulent and in many ways tragic time, but a time, as you say, that also has been filled with insight for all of us. But before we do that, of course, let me also introduce our sturdy co-host who's kept the show going now for so many weeks, and I'm delighted to be back on the program with him. It is, of course, Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, STC's resident dramaturg and co-host of Shakespeare Hour Live. Drew, how are things?
Hello, Simon, and welcome back to America, if I may be the first, or one of the first to say so. It's good to have you on this side of the Atlantic, safe and secure.
Well, Drew, thank you so much. I know the first person to welcome back was my brave taxi driver that collected me and my family from Dulles Airport on Monday evening, and said, yes, that would be fine. I'm sure we can get you home. Only to discover that about a mile from my new home in the plains, we hit an icy slope, and the only direction that we were able to take was unfortunately backwards as he slid to the point of pausing. Anyway, the heroic farm manager came out on his large pickup truck, and we saw his headlights coming through the snow, and we were extremely relieved to be rescued. But I think a question might even be coming in from a listener, a viewer right now. Grace Ann, hello, nice to see you.
Hi everyone, good evening. I just wanted to say no questions yet, but there are a lot of people in the comments also welcoming you back to America, Simon. One from Eleanor, she says she's so glad to see Simon back. And also so many people tonight, so thrilled to be joined by Mr. Michael Kahn. A comment from Ashley who says, Mr. Kahn certainly put STC on the map. So we're thrilled to have you all here with us tonight. So back over to Drew.
Yeah, so as you were saying, Simon, this is our final installment of this series of Shakespeare's Icons. And you know, Michael is our own personal icon of Shakespeare, or was for many decades at the Shakespeare Theatre Company. And when we approached Michael about doing this, he immediately said yes. But he also said, I will do this on one condition. I want to be a part of a conversation with Simon about directing Shakespeare. So we sort of a special homecoming for Simon, but also in more than one sense, it's a special homecoming for Michael as well. And I couldn't be more honored or thrilled to be part of facilitating this conversation tonight. Now, we've divided up approaches to directing Shakespeare in about 5 loose categories that hopefully we can touch on tonight during the show. I thought we would start with a discussion of how one prepares a Shakespeare text for performance. Obviously, this involves cutting the text, casting the text, table work, which is the period of rehearsal when you sit around the table before you are on your feet, discussing the meaning of the text, and then finally rehearsing scenes, staging the play. So a lot of preparation, obviously. And Michael, you were saying just before we went on air that there's a favorite sort of exercise that you like to do using Hamlet that illustrates the complexities of bringing Shakespeare to life in the theater. Is that right?
Yes, I think what I'd like to say first, though, is when you talk about directing a play of Shakespeare, one of the hardest things is getting out of your head all the things you know in advance about the play. I mean, I've been brought up, I saw a lot of Shakespeare in my life. I was taught a lot about Shakespeare at college. And to try to not have all of that influence me, that this is romantic, this is this, but to actually start reading it very carefully. So I read it for the story, then I read it for the individual scenes, and then eventually I actually read it line by line and word by word, trying to keep out, or finally keeping out, all the influences that I've had about Hamlet is simply a contemplative person, or so-and-so is a particularly awful person, or so, and seeing what the text actually is telling me from the text. So I realized when I was working with, well, it happened when I was working with opera singers first, but when I was working with actors, I would sometimes wonder, why are they not responding with some spontaneity or something like that? And I realized that basically they knew their own lines and were sort of waiting for their cue, but did not really hear what the other person was saying. I mean, they listened, but they didn't hear it. And so I started, after rehearsals. I'm sure this is the same thing with Simon, that you sit around and you read the play once, which is awful because you've hired all these people and they're going to be with you for the next 8 weeks, but they're always terrible most of the time on the first day because they're scared to death. Well, so am I, So you just do that and you say how lovely, and everybody applauds. You got to have cake, and then the next day, during it anyway, I start saying, "What did you say? Why did you say that?" No, I mean, what did you say, or what did you say, or what did you say? So I developed a little exercise that I used to do with students, and that I do with young actors. And take the first scene of Hamlet, which is always played in our theaters by very talented, very young, very inexperienced actors, unless you have a lovely company and you could put people of certain age in them. But usually it has been in the Shakespeare Theater for many years, non-equity actors, or, we had I forgot what they were called, fellows. Don't have to do that anymore, which is nice. And so we'd start with the first scene of Hamlet, and everybody knows. I mean, I used to think that Shakespeare wrote the first scene of Hamlet so that all the people who are going to come late could come late through it, or something like that, and so you listen to it, it's sort of like a weather report, or a thing on television when it's telling you where you are, and it's dark, cold. So I said, okay, let's start at the beginning. And so I don't remember these words, even though I've done this a million times. So I've asked Dr. Drew here to hold the book for me, which he has done before. Usually as a dramaturg, he's in the book, but this time I've asked him to hold the book and say, all right, this begins. I said, where is it? They say, either ramparts or castles. I ask questions about that, but then leave that. Let's say, so what's the first line? So Drew will say, who says it?
So I have it right here on my screen. I apologize to all you bibliophiles at home. I am doing digital Shakespeare. It's a scene between Francisco and Bernardo.
Right.
And the very first line in the play is Bernardo's line, "Who's there?"
Who's there? So I say, what does that mean? But they say, well, it means who's there. Okay. Does that mean anything to you? Well, forget about it. Let's keep on going.
Okay, and Francisco replies, nay, answer me, stand and unfold yourself.
Okay, so everybody knows what nay, answer me means. So then I say, okay, so what's the next line? Stand and unfold yourself. Now that's interesting. That's interesting. I don't usually say stand and unfold yourself. I mean, I know it's Elizabethan anyway. But what do you think it means? They say, well, it means stop. Okay, that makes sense. What else could it mean? Well, don't move. And then what do you think unfold yourself means? And they say, oh, I don't know. Oh, well, no. Stand. What else does stand mean? Well, maybe he's sitting, and maybe you want him to get up. I said, oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't read this scene. What does unfold yourself mean? Say, oh, well, maybe he's wearing a blanket. Maybe he's sitting and wearing a blanket. I said, that's interesting. I don't know if that means that or not, but let's go on a little bit. What's the next line?
All right, so Bernardo's reply is, long live the king.
Okay. They say, well, it means long live the king. And I say, well, let's hold as why that is there, but we know what that means. Let's go on. By now they're either fascinated or desperately to leave the room. Go on.
Okay, so in response to Bernardo saying long live the king, and this is the person who started the play saying who's there, Francisco says, Bernardo, question mark.
Okay, I said, why does he say Bernardo? He says, well, I guess he couldn't see him, or he recognizes him by his voice, or he doesn't know him very well. Well, keep all those ideas in your mind. Well, keep going.
Bernardo says he, period.
Well, okay, I guess we know what that means. You don't have to say, yeah, okay, means probably me. Go on.
And Francisco's reply, you come most carefully upon your hour.
I love that line. I think that's a great line. What the heck does that mean? So is it Bernardo? No, it's Francisco who's speaking, who adds the question, and Bernardo adds. So what does that mean? It said, you come most carefully upon your hour. Well, I guess it means you come on time. I said, yeah. But listen, here's the Oxford English Dictionary. Would you look up what carefully means? Would you look up the word careful? And they get to this big book, and they see 2.5 pages about the meaning of careful. They say, really? I said, well, let's read some of them. So they get, one is appropriately, or whatever the word is. Another one is another one. Another one is gently. And then I'd say, well, what do you think the word careful means? So they educate about it. I say, well, it could be tentative, it could be that. And then they say, well, maybe it's full of care. I said, well, I think that maybe one of the original reasons to be. So we're almost there to the end of this. This hour is almost over, I know. Go on. Drew, what do you...
Bernardo's reply to, you come most carefully upon your hour is, 'tis now struck 12. Get thee to bed.
Okay, so I say quickly, 12 when? And they all say 12 midnight. I say, why? Well, because they apparently can't see each other. I said, well, that's a pretty good thing. So either he's in a blanket or he's in a blanket, and it's still very dark. So how dark do you think it is? Drew.
Well, I think it's, it's funny, Michael. I'm flashing back to when I would sit next to you in rehearsal and you would very slowly, deliberately ask these questions, and I would always blurt the answer out. And you would wheel on me and say, "Not you, Drew. I know you know the answer."
Okay, well,
actors have to act it.
The two words that I want to get to, the other two lines, is it going on too long?
Okay, so Francisco says, "For this relief, much thanks. 'Tis bitter cold."
And how cold is bitter cold? Is that just normal cold, or is that bitter cold? Shakespeare was not just a writer trying to fill up a line of pentameter. He used particular words. He was a poet. He said bitter. Go on.
"'Tis bitter cold and I am sick at heart."
That's my other favorite line. So it's bitter cold and I am sick at heart. What does sick at heart mean? Well, it means something. And Bernardo's response to that is,
"Have you had quiet guard?"
he asks him, have you had quiet guard? All right, we know what that must mean. Go on. He's saying, has it been quiet out here? And he says,
"There's not a mouse stirring."
How quiet is that? That's really quiet. Is that bitter? Is that dark? Is that quiet? This sets up immediately an emotional situation, not an intellectual one, of somebody out there. Go on. I think that's two more lines.
"Well, good night. If you do meet Horatio and Marcellus."
Midnight. Congratulations. Go on.
"Good night. If you do meet Horatio and Marcellus, the rivals of my watch, bid them make haste."
All right. He knows two people are coming. Go on.
"I think I hear them. Stand ho, who's there?"
All right, so they hear them. So either they're on or they're off, but it's still dark and bitter cold. So he could have been in a blanket. Go on.
And then Horatio and Marcellus enter. Horatio says, "Friends to this ground."
Go on.
And Marcellus says, "Liegemen to the Dane."
Yeah, we now know somehow that's a password. Go on.
"Give you good night."
We know for sure. Go on.
And Marcellus, "Oh, farewell, honest soldier. Who hath relieved you?" "Bernardo has my place. Give you good night."
See yet. Now, I know in the Globe, everybody could see everybody, but these actors had to be really great to make it seem to be dark. Go on.
Okay, so Francisco exits. He says good night and exits. And Marcellus says, "Hola, Bernardo."
Go on. I'm sorry.
Bernardo, say, "What, is Horatio there?"
A piece of him. Go on. Yes.
"Welcome, Horatio. Welcome, good Marcellus." And Marcellus says, "What, has this thing appeared again tonight?"
All right. So Marcellus says this is the first mention of this thing. So what does that mean? He asks who? He asks Bernardo. He asked Bernardo, who's been on stage for a while now, say, has this thing appeared tonight? I guess it means there's been a thing that appeared at this time, at least he says that a little later on, and that Bernardo has been there before. Now let's just go back very fast. It's very dark. It's very quiet. It is very cold. The first man who comes on says, who's there? They can't see each other. And he says, you come very carefully on your hour. What do we mean by that? The next one is it's bitter cold and I am sick at heart. What do you think, what does Bernardo come on stage to do? To find out if the ghost is here. Only one person in that first scene knows there was a ghost. One person doesn't, but the other person, oh, I'm going on too long. Anyway, when he says carefully on your hour, perhaps he's coming quietly because maybe the ghost is there, maybe. And when the other guy says, I'm sick at heart, I suppose if I was Bernardo, I'd go, has he seen the ghost? Why is he sick at heart? And I ask him, have you had quiet guard? I don't care whether he's had quiet guard or not. I want to know if he's seen the ghost. That's an intention to play rather than asking a question that you know the answer. Okay, I'm done. But that is, for me, a lot of table work.
And it's so brilliant, Michael, because when you go back now and read those first lines at the top of the scene, Bernardo is like a completely different human being, and everything he says has a different meaning and a different purpose behind it.
In the middle, So when people say, "Oh, you have to, you learn your lines," I'm looking at, Simon. That's not true. Anyway, that will be the last time I will teach this exercise. So. Anyway, thank you for giving me that time, because it took a little while.
No, thank you, Michael. I'm curious, Simon, this tabula rasa approach that Michael talks about, really approaching everything with a blank slate and taking all of the language at face value in order to examine what it actually means, instead of this received wisdom of, oh, this is a great play, it's existentialist, and what does Freud say about it? What does Nietzsche say about it? Right, that stuff is all important. But this seems like such a fundamental part of the process that so many people skip over, right? I'm curious if this resonates with you.
Yeah, hugely. I mean, I think that we've just learned, haven't we, listening to Michael and Michael's work there, that the exercise illumines two things for me. One is what Stanislavski would call the present circumstances, the where, the when, the how, and that's incredibly valuable, not least to the director, because after rehearsing a scene like that, you realize when it comes to the tech, you've got to make that scene pretty dark, and you might ask your sound designer to give you some really chilly sound effects, or so actually it's world building. And the other thing that Michael's unlocked is, of course, is what Stanislavski also called subtext. So this question that Michael's illuminated, that when you ask a question, you're not really asking the literal question, you're asking another question underneath that question. And it's only through doing that painstaking work that you uncover those things. And you find what Peter Brook calls the secret play, which is the play that you as that group in that moment in time are telling. And nobody knows the answer to that before you start rehearsing, because the answer lies in the group consciousness of that particular unit in that particular moment in that particular place. I think also when I heard those words again under Michael's guidance, I was reminded too how clever Shakespeare is, because he establishes so many themes. Even the first line of "who's there" will resonate through the entire play. As a character in the case of Hamlet asks essentially that question again and again and again. Who's there inside me, inside you? What is the essence of a human being? And also, what does it mean to be sick at heart? That's another question the entire play poses. Mm-hmm. And lastly, I can't help but ponder the irony of long live the king. The king, of course, we will learn soon, has recently died. So who is the king will also be a question that the whole play will revolve around. So it's only through the close scrutiny that Michael's described that we can begin to grapple with these questions. And that's why I think it's such a brilliant way in. True.
I agree completely. You might laugh though. I did this exercise once for the director's lab at Lincoln Center, and when it was all over, one young director, full of passion, said, "Yeah, this is all interesting, but what if I want to set the play in the Weimar Republic?" And I thought, well, you put costumes on them, but I think the problems are going to be the same. You have to have the same answer. And that's one of the problems that people have now, is they get a concept, which is good, but they don't do the other work to fulfill that concept. And that's, anyway, that's why your productions make sense, Simon, and that's why I think people used to think my productions were clear. I used to feel a little bit, old-fashioned when I kept hearing how clear my productions were, and then I thought, well, all right, that's what I do. And secondly, I eventually got pleased that people actually said, "Gee, I didn't know." I understood the words in a way that I hadn't done before. But then there's a lot of technique involved after that. I mean, you have to, on the part of the actor, and Lord knows you want actors who are intelligent and emotional and physical and imaginative and free and full of enormous skill and technique. And we can talk about casting later.
Well, I was going to ask, Michael, since you brought it up, this question about fidelity to the text, which I think is a really important one for 21st century Shakespeare. And I remember you telling me once that your own thoughts on this issue changed, that when you were a younger director in the 60s and 70s, you were more interested in saying what you had to say through Shakespeare's plays. And then as you grew older, it was more about, as you say, clarifying what's already there in the play. In some cases, maybe even changing a word or two so that audiences will get it, will understand it without, setting it in Nazi Germany or in a kind of glib conceptual historical period, resetting the play. So, I think this is somewhere where everyone comes down at a different place, at a different point in their career or in their life. But do you feel like you ended up landing in a place where you were really, that you knew the answer to how one should approach Shakespeare? Should one be faithful, or is it a kind of chimera?
I never asked myself that question. And certainly when I started, and I should have, and I did, and it was important to try to say who you were. There are plenty of young directors, and I was a young director, and I was also full of, influences and feelings about the theater, and you should have them, and you should keep having them all your life. But so I felt what I wanted to say with the play was, I picked plays because I thought they said what I wanted to say, and I did productions that, Henry V on a Seesaw, an anti-war play. I mean, when I did it again, I realized it was much more complicated than that, and to try to squeeze a play, into one concept, like squeezing toothpaste, is just completely unfair to Shakespeare. But, I got out of the noise and I became me, and that was fine. And then that was only because I had done 3 plays, so after a while, things changed. But let me say that I never believed in changing the text. I believed in rearranging the text sometimes. I believed in changing a word if the word nice meant something different than it means now, and I could find a one-syllable word that fit nice, I would change it. That was because the audience, arrives anyway, think they're not going to understand a word. Somebody said to me, "Is that the way they spoke in Elizabethan England?" I said, "I don't think they got up in the morning and spoke like Shakespeare. I think he was a poet. I don't think people get up in the morning now and speak like E. Cummings or, Adrian Rich. I think they don't. They're poets." So, and then I got where I really wanted to. I got by doing this amount of close reading, felt that I was somehow connected to Shakespeare more than I was to myself. That's why, when you have a program called Icons of Shakespeare, which, normally would freeze me, because the one thing you cannot be as a director is ever feel like an icon. The first thing you really have to do is take, it sounds strange because me, and I mean, I have an ego. We all have egos. We wouldn't be trying to run a theater if we didn't have an ego. We'd let somebody else do all that work. But you have to put your ego on hold to get to what you think the playwright's talking about. And I mean that with any playwright. It's easier with a great playwright than with a bad playwright, because with a bad playwright, you have to kind of make all the nonsense and the bad writing and all of that seem to make sense by whatever tricks you can do. But so I've never minded when people manipulate the text. I've minded when people change the text to another meaning than was meant to be there. But I have to say, and I'm sure Simon will say, in England is quite different, but very often you do something and nobody knows you've done it anyway. That people are not as acquainted with the text or have seen as many productions. So they're not always sure that you've done that. I don't know, England, Simon, I think audiences get to see more Shakespeare than American audiences do. I don't know. You would know that.
Also, Simon is unmuting himself.
I think that, no, Michael, it's a fascinating question about the difference, yes, it's between England and America in lots of ways. I mean, I think that you're right, because in England, we tend to see the plays many more times. I think there is a relaxation about textual playfulness, let's call it. In my limited experience of doing Shakespeare in America, when I did Time in New Athens, where there was quite a lot of textual interpolations, textual changes, cuttings, I actually used different lines from other Shakespeare plays to pad out what, a play that Shakespeare only wrote half of it anyway. So I felt there were enough impurities in that text to justify a few more impurities. But some of the critics, the American critics, one in particular, did get very exercised about this and did want to know exactly where those lines had come from and why I had felt like I was allowed to change the play. And in a way that actually no one in England, no critic commented at all on the textual interpolations that I made for the Royal Shakespeare Company. So, yes, different cultures, different countries, different moments in time have different relationships with these kind of practices. I think on the whole, the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? If you go and see a Shakespeare play that's made better by some changes, some cuts, some realignments, and it's a fantastic night at the theatre, I think you've done your job very well. If you go and see a play that doesn't really make sense and is sort of haphazardly organised and you walk away thinking, oh, I've had a bewildering and rather boring evening at the theatre, then many of the decisions the director has made in that case would appear to be the wrong ones. So I think we can all be pragmatic about these things rather than, dare I say, principled. Drew.
I know that Drew will remember this, but I had done Richard II originally in Stratford, Connecticut. The king came in, he had a cat in his crown. That was what mostly I remember. That was his idea, is his own cat. And then I did it in Washington with Richard Thomas. And both times, those are the first two times I did it, there's this first scene where Richard is talking to, there's a trial going on and Mowbray is being tried. And then there's supposed to be a tournament, but Richard stops the tournament, banishes Mowbray. And the scene is pretty much over. Bushy, Bagot, and Green are there. And I have never done so much pantomime in my life in a scene the first time with, now, Richard Thomas was playing Richard. You have to look at Mowbray like this, and then Mowbray has to look like this, and you have to pass these secrets because it's all political. You're all letting somebody off who did something that you made him do. And I thought, eventually, nobody knows what it's about at all, but we're all busy acting our heads off trying to make it all clear. And so when I got down to it the third time with a wonderful actor, Michael Hayden, I thought the Elizabethan audience knew the history before Richard II. They had seen a play called Woodstock that had come out just before or at the same time, but they knew the history. They didn't need the backstory. They knew the backstory. So Shakespeare didn't need to explain it. But I had tried twice and it was just awful. The play wouldn't take place till about scene 4. So I went to Woodstock and it's not a very good play, but it is the whole thing about the murder of Woodstock. But it starts out with Richard, the 3 uncles. So you know who John of Gaunt is, you know who Woodstock is, you know who the other uncle is. You know, Bushy, Bagot, Green are now given the occasion to create laws and collect money or whatever it is. You see people angry about that, 3 favorites getting a position. All of that happens. Then there's a scene where Woodstock is killed, had Mowbray kill him. And then there was a beautiful scene where the Duchess of Gloucester maybe buries her husband, the 3rd uncle, and she and John of Gaunt have a wonderful scene about Richard's problems. And then we went into the scene. And everybody knew it was a lie. It was a setup. They knew everything. And the play started, Shakespeare's play started where it should have started, with everybody knowing what went on. And it was a production I was happy with, but also no one knew those were new scenes. Not one single person wrote those were new scenes. And I once said to somebody who was going to do the play, if you want to, I'd tell you to read Woodstock. But it made the difference, just like you said for Timon, that all of a sudden that play had meaning from the very beginning. And I believe in that. So, when I did King John, I guess I found a big speech from the John and I put it in, and it helped. And so I believe that. And I think as far as cutting goes, Simon can talk about this. I think cutting is fine, but I don't think you cut just for hours. You cut for clarity. You cut for focus. You don't cut to just be 2-hour shows that people can get home. That's not what a Shakespeare theater does. But I love going over the play over and over and over again and see, why is that line there? And all of a sudden, well, we don't need it. Well, with O'Neill, I mean, you just go, O'Neill didn't believe that actors could do it. So he had them say everything. And then you think, well, actors can do that. My God, I don't need to say that. I don't need to say that. I don't need to say that. And all of a sudden the play makes sense. So I don't. And I said once, I don't care if you do it on roller skates or kabuki, as long as you're telling the story of that play and what that play means to you, but through the text. And then,
wow, that's, or roller skates, yes, kabuki, or even both. Yes, sorry, Drew.
In other words, Michael, with certain plays and certain scenes, when you do scrutinize them, as you do in the first scene of Hamlet, you find oceans and oceans of meaning, incredible layers to the language to play. But it's only after you do that work that you can say, oh, actually something's missing. And I need to actually do some research, which is the second step, and find out if there are, earlier versions of this play, versions by other authors, things that could clarify what's going on. Because when you talk about Richard II, it's almost like, the events of January 6, 2020 in the Capitol here, and then the play takes place on January 7th. And everybody knows what happened on January 6th. And all the arguments in Richard II are over, basically this constitutional crisis about what to do with this king who is not behaving well. But all of that implicit knowledge needs to be dramatized in some way for an audience. So it's fascinating to hear how both the scrutiny of the play can reveal what's there, but also what's not there, what actually sends you to other sources, as Simon did with Timon.
Our job is to, do a bunch of things. One thing is to make the play come alive. That's, to give it the life that it has, and to communicate that to the audience, and instead of discommunicate it, you know what I mean, by covering it up with stuff that interferes with that. But that doesn't mean you can't invent. I mean,
right. It doesn't mean your work stops just at faithfully staging what's there on the play. Simon, you had a I think a point.
Yes, I was going to do two things. I was going to say absolutely yes to context, and I think giving an audience a context to understand the play and a scene is critical. I mean, I remember when I did Richard II, discovering that he was crowned as a young boy king, because a lot of the plays also about him going, but I am the king. I have the divine right of kings. I am nobody if I am not the king. And this was a very alien concept, I think, for an audience today. What does that really mean? So in fact, I created a silent prologue, with music but no text, where we saw the boy king being coronated. This is when I directed it at the Globe. And there was just something about seeing a small child having this crown put on their head that did, I think, somehow illumine the predicament of Richard as a man, grappling with what he believed to be a kind of death when he ceased to be the ruler. So these are all techniques that make context live. And I think it's so important to have these conversations like we're having, because as you say, Michael, directors, including me, sometimes just forget that the context is everything. And my last point about the histories is that I have a dream one day to do all 9 history plays together, because I think that's another extraordinary way of getting that very thing you described, Michael, of context, and how one play in the 9 plays informs the next, informs the next, informs the next. And Richard III comes at the end of that cycle of plays. And I think when you see Richard III through the context of all that has come before, it's infinitely richer and infinitely clearer and infinitely worth your $50 ticket price, or however much tickets cost these days. Who knows in the world of the pandemic? We've all forgotten. Now, look, I'm going to briefly do my interval speech now, if I may, since we're well past the half-an-hour mark. So I just want to say we've got some terrifically exciting episodes coming up. You can see the full list on the screen. I think now, great. Future guests include the remarkable Maureen Dowd, the completely distinguished Sir Jonathan Bate, and the legendary Julie Taymor, and many more. You can learn more and register on our website, and we'll be here, of course, every Wednesday as we keep going on our crusade through Shakespeare and many hours to come. Well, we're going to keep going in our extremely enlightening conversation with Michael. Grace Ann, I don't know whether there are any comments or thoughts from the audience that you'd like to share with us, and then Drew will take us to the next chapter of our conversation. Grace Ann.
Sure. I will say, viewer Janet Martin says, bring them on, your 9-play history cycle. And Mary Fraker also says, I want to see Simon's history cycle. So you've got 2 tickets right there. There is a viewer, maybe 2 viewer questions that could take us into the next sort of topic, which I think is influences and, favorite past productions or productions that might have surprised you. So I have 2 questions in that front. One viewer asked, anonymous, for you, Michael, your feelings on Chekhov, how you feel about producing Chekhov. I could see your head in your hands, and what informs that feeling. And the second question is, and I think this could really be for all 3 of you, were there any STC productions, or Simon, I think productions at past theaters where you've worked, whose success, either popular or artistic, has surprised you? And that question is from James Carr. So those 2 questions. I don't know if anyone wants to start, or if Drew, you want to fill in. So. Well,
I guess I get the Chekhov question. And whoever anonymous is, you probably asked me this question for the last 20 years. We're the only theater that has never done Chekhov. That's true. And Chekhov is one of the great writers of all time. But I thought all the other theaters have done Chekhov. That's one thing. Secondly, you want to ask me why I don't do Chekhov? Several reasons, and they're all selfish. One is I did Chekhov at Stratford. I did a Three Sisters with an amazing cast of Kate Morris-Kanofsky and Brian Bedford and Kate Reed and Maria Tucci and Roberta Maxwell, and Brian was the best Tusenbach that year, and I had a very, 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 very hard time. I didn't understand how to do it. And I actually ran away from rehearsals for a couple of days. I mean, it was that hard. And I think it was a bunch of actors, a bunch of great actors, but they were not necessarily an ensemble. But the other thing is, having taught at Juilliard for 50 years, the second year production is always Chekhov. So I've seen 50 student productions of Chekhov, and I think that was it. I could say I saw 50 productions of Shakespeare, but I saw 50 productions of Chekhov. So, and when I left the theater, I remember saying, oh my God, I didn't let Rebecca Teichman do the Chekhov she wanted to do. I didn't let somebody else do the Chekhov. But there were so many other plays to do that nobody else was doing, like the Musset and O'Neill and Schiller. And, Ibsen was nobody, I mean, so let them all do Chekhov and let everybody else do Long Day's Journey too. We didn't do that. There are plenty of places to see it. We didn't do it. That's that. I will definitely get my tickets to Simon's history, and I want him to do it, and I know how hard it is to do in a season or a bunch of seasons, and you want to run them all at the same time at some point, which is start getting ready to help support that production because it'll be worth it. I'm telling you now. But Simon can answer whatever influenced Simon. I'll tell you what influenced me. But Simon, what influenced you?
Wow. Well, this is all yes. Influences. Well, look, I think I was influenced a lot by Peter Brook, which I'm sure many of our viewers, I'm sure Michael has been as well, of The Empty Space, his seminal book about theatre, of seeing Adrian Lester be in Hamlet, his very stripped down production, and actually speaking to the question of what surprised me. I mean, I guess I expected it to be great, but he made a lot of textual changes, including cutting the first scene entirely and just starting with scene 2, which was exciting. And so I think that was a huge influence for me. And just going to the Royal Shakespeare Company, I guess, and Nick Heidner's work at the National Theatre was another person who's working in Shakespeare, highly modern Shakespeare productions that were very grounded in naturalistic modern detail and a very strong sense of world were very influencing. But I think for me also to say that the actors have influenced my work. So when I did Hamlet, the West African Hamlet, which came to Washington, that was largely influenced by the West African actor that was playing Hamlet, who I had the idea together with, and that was a great reminder of sometimes when you have very strong relationships with leading artists, that can be a learning for the director. And most recently I've had that with Ray Fiennes, with Antony and Cleopatra, and indeed on Romeo and Juliet. And there was a striking moment which has come to me during our conversation this evening when we were filming a scene in the film with Jessie Buckley playing Juliet, who's an extraordinary Irish actress. You might know her from Chernobyl and Wild Rose, and I'm thinking of Ending Things on Netflix. Anyway, and we decided to film a scene not in the original, which is Juliet waiting for Romeo to come to her home. It's the scene before they wake up together in bed, in the Lark and the Nightingale scene, and he's surreptitiously coming to spend a night with her in her home with her parents downstairs. And I said to Jessie, it was going to be this moment of him arriving and up from the balcony into her bedroom. And I said to Jessie, well, maybe you're kind of, lighting a scented candle or kind of doing it. And she's like, no, not doing anything like that. I'm just pacing. I'm just waiting for the guy. I'm not going to be like saying sweet like a scented candle. And it was just a great reminder of how exciting being with actors are, because they've just got or in Jess's case especially, a much more visceral sense of what a person is doing in any given moment than the director has. Grace Ann.
Well, this may have answered the question, Simon, your last comment, but we have a question from Suzanne and Gary, who ask if either of you, Simon or Michael, have ever acted in a Shakespeare play, or if you ever wanted to act. I don't know if either of your beginnings were there.
Before I hand over to Michael for his answer to that, I'll just say briefly, yes, I mean, some of the viewers might know that I did start as an actor when I was 13. I was in an E. Nesbitt series called Five Children and It, which was a classic Victorian costume drama. I think I was definitely richest at 13 than I've ever been since. And so it was a golden time in my imagination. The problem was I wasn't a very good actor. So I carried on trying to do bit parts in TV shows until the work dried up when I was 17. But before I bowed out of my short-lived but exciting career, I did get to play Hamlet in my school play. And talking about influences, the summer before I played Hamlet in the school play, I listened to Kenneth Branagh as recordings. So he did it on the radio. And Kenneth Branagh became my teacher as I was learning the monologues over a hot summer in Hertfordshire, England. Ken Branagh's voice was with me. I've never met Kenneth Branagh, but when I do, I'm going to thank him for teaching me about Shakespeare. Drew.
Well, I do want to hear Michael's answer to the question, but just to return back briefly to things that surprised me, it was actually the approach that you were talking about, Michael, where when you were answering the question about Chekhov, how you did not want to do the most canonical classical texts first. You wanted to really cast your net widely. I remember we did The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde after I came to the theater. And it was the last of the 4 Wilde plays that we had done, after A Woman of No Importance, after An Ideal Husband. And you said to me, anyone can do The Importance of Being Earnest, Drew. We should be the theater making the case for the greatness of these lesser known and neglected texts, which is something that I really took to heart and which really deeply influenced how I think about the theater's function. I do want to make room as we end the hour for this conversation about past, present, and future classical theater. Where do you see classical theater going in the 21st century, especially as it continues to diversify? How do we make room for new voices at the center of classical theater while retaining, as you said, this sense of faithfulness, this sense of connection to Shakespeare, to these things that are at the core of what classical theater is? So I think that's a really interesting and important question to ponder. But first, Michael, have you ever acted?
Once I took over a little theater in Virginia a very long time ago, and I put myself in, and then there were none, or whatever that is, the Agatha Christie, and I directed it, but I gave myself the part of the guy who gets killed first. And I was so grateful because I was very, very nervous. But I never wanted to act. I wanted to direct when I was 5 years old. And I can't believe I was allowed to do it for such a long time. And I never thought of myself as an actor. But to get back, I'll just say very quickly that I was very influenced by Peter Brook. Peter Brook productions, and not early Peter Brook productions, but Peter Brook productions that started around the Dream. And after I saw the Dream in Stratford, I never could do the play again. It was just that, when you see, and I saw Giorgio Strehler's The Tempest, which was an Italian, and I never could do the Tempest again, because when you see a good production, you can always do it. There's some time between a good production, but if you see a great life-changing production, why do it? I'm fighting myself, I'm fighting my own feelings of what was so extraordinary. So, but I was also influenced by other things. I was influenced by Martha Graham and Noguchi. I was very much influenced by the Kabuki, when I was doing Henry V, and by Brecht, so I had every scene. Somebody read the title and somebody hit the sticks, and so there were things that were not just plays that influenced me, but my mother read Shakespeare to me as a bedtime thing when I was 6, and she read all of Shakespeare without cutting it. So I grew up with that, and that was somehow, and then I realized one day that I didn't want to do easy plays. I walked down Broadway and I looked at Broadway. I was a New Yorker, and I looked and said, I didn't want to do any of these plays except Tennessee Williams, and I wanted to do Shakespeare and hard plays. So what you said about Adrian Lester's Hamlet, I think sometimes you can't do a play without wanting that person to do it. You can't do Hamlet. I mean, I've done 3 Hamlets, and each time it's only because I wanted to do Hamlet with that person. They were all 3 very different people, and different successes of production. And to this day, there are plays that I would like an actor, but didn't have the actor want to do it with. And that's very hard. And that's what's so difficult about casting, I think, and sometimes you wait 3 years for somebody to say, I've always wanted to do this play, but they didn't do it. And I can think of, I think you have to have, it's interesting when Simon talks about the king as a little boy. That's something very personal in some way to Simon. I don't know what, but it is. It's something very personal to him. I wouldn't think of that. That would not be personal to me, but on the same time, I understand cutting the first scene of Hamlet because Hamlet comes in and says everything in his speech that happened. I kept it in because I had this idea of a play, a concept of the play. Then I had it 3 years before we could do it because of the actor. By the time the actor said yes, another brilliant director in London had done a Hamlet with the same concept. And I thought, I cannot do it. That's ridiculous. I cannot do it. I'd worked on it for 3 years. I cannot do it. Robert Ickes did it. It was wonderful. I didn't see it. And then I could, that was when the actor was free and I couldn't, I said to the theater, I can't do it. And they said, well, you have to do it. I mean, everyone wants to see this actor. So I did it, but all during the time I thought, well, I did it for him, but now I've got this concept that I think I started, but somebody else did it. And it was a very odd experience. So I was relying on my relationship with that actor and his personality. And that actually focused the play more on him rather than on this other concept that I had. I don't know if that answers 4 questions, but
no, I think you've done a great job tying up a lot. I wonder, Simon, if you wanted maybe to speak to this question of 21st century Shakespeare.
Yes, well, I mean, it's a fascinating one. Thank you, Jordan. I know we've only got 3 minutes left and I want to pivot around and hear the last word from Michael, of course. But wow, times change, don't they? Audiences change, the history changes, and it's a relentless project to adjust ourselves to the changes that we see in the world. And that's why I think we have to be extremely flexible. It makes me think of this wonderful phrase of Peter Brooks that I think I've quoted on this show before: hold on tightly, let go lightly. And I think of that in terms of baggage, of history, of preconceptions that Michael spoke about, letting go of them and really going, for example, with those history plays. And thank you for those people that have already pledged to buy their ticket, and to Michael for committing to be there on the opening night. It would be a real question of going, right, how do those 9 plays speak to now? How do we cut them? How do we organize them? How do we edit them? What are the values, the questions, the dilemmas, the predicaments that we want to draw out of those plays? Because I think another wonderful phrase from Peter Brook was, sometimes if you let a play speak for itself, it will be silent. So the job of the director is to conjure the voice out of a play in whatever means is available to you. So Shakespeare is no different. If Shakespeare's going to survive, he's going to require brave directors, and I love what Michael said about being personally connected to a text, brave directors of all backgrounds to conjure the voice afresh from on those plays to keep them speaking alive in a vivid way to now. Michael.
Well, that's exactly the answer. And you have to bring in different voices as directors, designers, dramaturgs, in certain places. I mean, all everybody to let other voices respond to the same play. If somebody says, I hate Shakespeare, I don't believe in Shakespeare, then that's not the person to do it. That's not a voice saying, I see Shakespeare's meaning this for me. But if somebody says, this means this, or I can see this, then you have a transformation. And what's so wonderful is that so many young directors and designers have appeared that we didn't know about 10 years ago or 5 years ago, or that we were not smart enough or free enough to bring in. So I look forward to that. And I think every theater is moving that way. The one thing about Shakespeare is, I've said this a lot, Shakespeare has changed all the time, from the time it was written to now. He survived all of us, and will continue to survive all of us as we bring him into our world and move forward with him in our world. But he's big enough for all of us. And that, I think, is what makes it to do it with this writer.
Great. Beautiful sentiments, Simon.
Well, he's big enough for all of us. I love that. Thank you, Michael. And look, I mean, it's just now my job to kind of bring the ceremony to an end, as it were, to say thank you to Michael for joining us tonight, for bringing his humanity, his wisdom, his kindness, his insight, his decades of experience working on Shakespeare. It's such a pleasure, Michael, to be in dialogue with you this evening and to see you looking so well and so full of passion and fire and vision as always. Next week, we're going to be celebrating Valentine's Day with a special episode on Shakespeare's couples, which I'm already thinking through. How could Verona relate to this? Right through to, of course, to Antony and Cleopatra. We'll be joined by a real-life couple, actors Christian Kahn and Eshmina Mendes. You may remember Christian, who was last seen at STC in 2018 in The Comedy of Errors, directed by Alan Paul, as Antipholus of Ephesus. And in the meantime, do think of your own Shakespearean couple, duo, that you perhaps would like us to talk about. We're ready to do so at your bidding. Thanks for tuning in. It's good night from me. It's good night from Grace Ann, from Michael, from Dr. Drew Lichtenberg. Good night and stay safe, everyone. See you next week. Cheerio.